Well, I'd like to thank Britt for doing a great job last week with Daniel chapter 6. I was a little disappointed when I realized how this was playing out. I think through the sermon series a long ways in advance, and when it comes to the book of Daniel, there is one reason that preachers want to preach the book of Daniel. It's Daniel 6. It's Daniel in the lion's den. I mean, that passage just begs to be preached. And when I knew we were going to be gone, I'm looking at the schedule going, well, let's see, who's going to be speaking on that day? And it's like, what? He gets it, I don't. Well, that's all right. He did a great job of it. Thank you, Britt. That was wonderful. Now, I checked the video, and they apparently edited out the water balloon fight. I know with the children's guy doing this, but I really love that thing he had from Louis Giglio on that remix of prayer. That, for me, was just such a takeaway from it. If you were here last week, maybe you heard it. Louis said that so often our prayers consist of, bless me, watch over me, protect me. And he suggested that we learn to pray a different way, which is, let me bless God. May God live through me, and no matter what, God, may you use me. I just thought that is a great way for us to rethink how we come to God in prayer. Well, today, we are going to launch into what is the challenging half of Daniel, is Daniel's visions of the future. I wish I could say that when I thought about doing the book of Daniel, that I was just excited about the chance to get to dig into Daniel's prophetic visions. That would actually not be true. In fact, I thought about just doing a character study on Daniel and stopping at Daniel 6, because the second half of Daniel is just difficult in a lot of ways. This is dream imagery, it's vision imagery, and so there's a lot of confusing stuff there, a lot of strange imagery that comes out of it. And quite frankly, in the history of the church, a lot of strange stuff has been done with that strange information. And I do not really want to add to the body of strange information. So I'm going to try to avoid that. And there are a couple things that I think we need to understand as we start into this section. One of those has to do with just this whole area of apocalyptic literature. That's the big fancy theological word for the prophetic writings about the end of the world. When we come to the Bible's apocalyptic sections, the last part of the book of Daniel, pretty much all the book of Revelation, and a few other places, we encounter image upon image, and a lot of them very bizarre and hard to understand images. And sometimes we find stuff that even seems nonsensical. There are these bizarre monsters. There are images of flame and smoke, mysterious voices, mysterious numbers. And the way that those images have been interpreted throughout the years is incredibly varied. And whole theological trains of thought have come up, and fights have been had over how do we understand some of these visions. I'm not a prophecy buff. It's not what I feel an expert in. And some of you may have been around enough to realize there's a lot of big terms that get thrown around when you talk about prophecy. Maybe you've heard things like premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial, pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib, pre-wrath rapture, et cetera, and you go, what is all of that, and how do you make sense of it? So I've invited a special guest to come, August 8th. A couple of weeks from now, the end of the world and how Christians see it. I've invited Dr. Jerry Brashears from Western Seminary to come, and Jerry's going to just try and give us kind of a big picture of what is it all about, and why do Christians see some of these things so differently, and what do they see? What do they believe about the end times? And so Jerry's going to speak in both of our morning services. He's also going to do a workshop Sunday afternoon from 2 to 4. And so I would encourage you, if you can, plan to set some time aside to come and get in on that. I think it will help give you some clarity. Let me show you a couple pictures. And I want some audience participation here. I'm going to put a picture up, and as soon as I do, I just want you to shout out the concept, the words that come to mind when you see these images. Okay, you ready? Here goes. Image number 1. What do you see? America. Freedom. Okay, is there anything inherent about an eagle that says America? It's not written on the eagle anywhere. There's no tag made in America on the eagle. Nothing about the eagle says necessarily freedom, and yet First service did the same thing. We see that image, we go, freedom, America, there it is. Okay, let me show you another image. You ready? Okay, first concepts that jump to your mind when you see this image, what is it? Dumb, confused, bird brain, all that kind of stuff. Did you know that in the founding of our country, if Benjamin Franklin had had his way, when you saw this picture flash up, you would have yelled, "America!" because he wanted that to be our national bird. Now, the reason is a wild turkey is actually very clever, very smart, very alert. And so Franklin thought that would be a great symbol of our country. The fact is, eagles oftentimes are kind of scavengers. So if you think about it, that's not really a pleasant thought. But all cultures do this. We have certain images that take on meanings far beyond the image itself that we associate things with. And certainly when you get to prophetic imagery, you'll find that God gave to Daniel images that conveyed some powerful concepts to Daniel. But it's important, before we jump too quickly to deciding what those images mean, that we first understand what did they mean to the culture that Daniel lived in, rather than superimposing our own. I remember hearing one teacher years ago talking about prophecy. And his conclusion was that whenever you see an eagle in prophetic writing, you should understand that it's pointing toward the United States. And whenever you see a bear, you should understand that it's pointing toward Russia. Now, I'm pretty sure that when Daniel had the dream, he did not come to from the dream and go, "Oh my goodness, an eagle, a bear, it's America and Russia, and it's the Cold War." That was not what those images conveyed to Daniel. And so if we're going to make sense of the images, you need to start off with, who was it that got the picture to begin with? What did it mean to them? A few other basic principles to keep in mind. Tremper Longman, a commentator, suggested some of these as I was reading this week, and I thought it was really good. And the first one, when we talk about apocalyptic writing, is I think we should be reserved in what we have to say. Where the text is vague, we should be vague. We shouldn't understand things that not even Daniel understood. And that means we've got to stay humble. I know it feels great to go say, "I got it figured out." But the fact is, there's parts of this that Daniel couldn't figure it out. None of us can really figure out for sure what some of this stuff is talking about because it is symbolic imagery. And that is the second thing, recognize that symbolism abounds. There is a mindset that says when you come to prophetic literature that you should take it literal unless it's just too bizarre. And that's a wrong way to come at it. Understand that in these visions, it's all about symbolism, and it's conveying this bigger message. And so be careful about over-literalizing things that you find in a vision. And along with that, I'd say be cautious with numbers. This is what tends to get people in a lot of trouble with prophetic literature. It's trying to figure out all the numbers with the idea that if I can figure out what the numbers mean, then I can start setting dates and I can name days. And that's where people start making their errors. Daniel 7, we've got this phrase, time, times, and half a time. What does that mean? Or in Daniel 9, the 70 weeks. Revelation 20 talks about the 1,000 years. This is where we get the idea of the millennial kingdom. Revelation 13 has that infamous number 666, the number of the Antichrist, right? And everybody's trying to figure out what does that mean. Years ago, I used to know the formula. This was back in the 70s. And if you did it just right, I think you had to take the letters of his name, transpose them to their Hebrew counterparts, and Hebrew letters stand for numbers, so then you take those, get the numbers, and then somehow you did the math, and it came out equaling 666, and based on that, we all knew, based on the letters of his name, that Henry Kissinger was, in fact, the Antichrist. So, speaking of Henry, be careful of those kinds of sensational and overly specific interpretations. How many of you remember back in the 70s when Hal Lindsey published his late great Planet Earth? I mean, that book was a bestseller for a long time, and Hal had tried to define what all the end-time events were going to be and happened to interpret them to all be pretty much about current events in the 70s. In the 80s, Edgar Whisenant published a book called 88 Reasons for 1988. Kind of missed that one. when I was a kid, I went through a phase of being really enamored with this kind of prophetic interpretation. Because, man, you could figure this out. You could decipher today's newspaper based on, what you found in Daniel and Revelation. And I saw this film that, at the time, purported that it was going to reveal how the prophecies of Revelation were being fulfilled in today's headlines. And it went to this verse out of Revelation chapter 9, verses 7 through 10. It says, "The shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared to battle. They had breastplates, as it were breastplates of iron. The sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots of many horses running to battle. They had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tails." Okay, what is this? Who are the locusts, and what's this great noise they make, and the armor plating, and the battle, and the stinging tails, and what is John talking about here in Revelation? And yes, this is it. It's a Russian attack helicopter that has a gun in its tail that is shooting. And that's what the film said, that, man, this is it. Revelation is being fulfilled right now via Russian armored helicopters. Other people that have made a notorious name for themselves from this kind of stuff, maybe remember Harold Camping. Camping first predicted that Judgment Day was going to occur on September 6, 1994. He then revised that to September 29th, revised it again to October 2nd. None of that happened. But then in 2005, he had another prediction. Said he'd redone the math, he got some of the numbers wrong, and this time he's got it figured out, and the second coming is going to happen on May 21st, 2011. Well, after May 21st passed, he said that a spiritual judgment had occurred, and that the physical rapture would occur on October 21st, 2011. And then when October 21st went past, he said, what's happened is God has had mercy on us just like he did on Nineveh in the days of Jonah, and it was going to be that day, but God has decided to hold off. So I wasn't wrong. God was just merciful. The result of that was that his organization, Family Radio, which ran a large chain of Christian radio stations, suffered a significant loss of assets, and they had to lay off staff and lost revenue. And Camping himself finally admitted that he no longer believed that anybody could actually know the time of the rapture or the end of the world. So, all that to say, if you come to Daniel with the intent of filling out your appointment calendar, I think you're making a big mistake. Second thing when we come to Daniel is to understand the literary structure. The book of Daniel, I sent out a link to a video several weeks ago. It's up on Right Now Media, done by a group called the Bible Project. They do these wonderful synopses of books. This is the synopsis they do of the book of Daniel, showing the structure of it. One of the distinctive traits is that Daniel is written in a combination of Hebrew and Aramaic. The first chapter is in Hebrew. The last chapters, beginning with chapter 8 on to 12, are in Hebrew, and the middle chapters, 2 through 7, are done in Aramaic. It appears that the reason for this is that the aim of chapters 2 through 7 was being aimed toward the Gentile world, and so it's written in the trade language of the people, whereas 8 through 12 was directed more toward the Hebrews, thus it's written in Hebrew. And within that, you find an interesting pairing of chapters. There's a link between chapter 2 and 7, chapter 3 and 6, and chapter 4 and 5. What it is, I'm going to give you a big word here. It's called a chiastic structure. And what chiastic means is when you make an argument that has several parts to it. And so you go A, B, C, the different points of the argument, and then you make the same points of argument, but in reverse order, C, B, A. And Daniel has this kind of chiastic structure. I'll show you what that looks like. Chapter 2 and chapter 7 have this relationship. Chapter 2 is Nebuchadnezzar's vision. Chapter 7 is Daniel's vision. Chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's vision has a 4-part statue equaling 4 kingdoms. Daniel's vision, you have 4 beasts equaling 4 kingdoms. In both of them, the final analysis is that God's kingdom wins. Then you have the pairing of chapter 3 and 6. There we have Hebrews delivered from the furnace. Daniel's friends are Shadrach, Meshach, and I always said Abednego. Somebody else said, no, it's Abednego. I have no idea. But anyway, the 3 of them are delivered. And then in Daniel 6, which Britt covered last week, we have Daniel, another Hebrew, being delivered, this time not from a furnace, but being delivered from lions. And then in the middle, we have chapter 4 and 5. In chapter 4, we saw Nebuchadnezzar judged for his pride. In chapter 5, we find Belshazzar judged for his pride. So do you see the structure to that? And usually the center part of the chiasm is like the focal point. It's saying the message of this is that God is the one who is the judge over the kingdoms of men. And all these things point to that. Chapter 7 is also pivotal because it transitions us from the narrative, the biography part of Daniel, over to the prophetic portion of the book. When you get to Daniel chapter 7 and verse 1, we find that we're moving back in time a little bit. We're now in the first year of, and here's another one of those, you can debate how to say it, I grew up with Belshazzar. My wife, after I'd preached on this, said, I think it's Belshazzar. I said, wow, that sounds way better. I mean, that's far cooler, Belshazzar. But however you want to say it, we're back in his time. And Daniel's having this vision. Daniel 7, verse 2. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. Okay, imagery. What are the concepts? What did it mean to these people? Now, to us, the sea is just a body of water. We take cruises on the sea. We go fishing on the sea. We go crabbing on the sea. That's all good. But in Daniel's time, for these ancient people, the sea was a terrifying thing. A number of years ago, I took the family out for a Sunday afternoon drive. We still had little kids at home, and it was a really stormy day. The wind was blowing like crazy, and that's one of the reasons we drove out was we could see if the spit had been breached, right? And so we're out there, and you know how Dungeness Bay is. The wind can come up just like that. And as we looked down, we saw a rowboat down below us. There appeared to be a father and a little girl in the rowboat, and we could tell the dad was rowing as hard as he could, but he's fighting the wind, and he's not doing very well. And it's getting pretty choppy out there. And I finally told Burnett, I said, I think we better call for some help for these guys. So I called 911. They put me through the Coast Guard, told the Coast Guard what was going on. And as we're watching, this guy finally got around a point of land enough that it broke the wind some, and he was able to make some headway. But within just a few minutes, here comes this Coast Guard helicopter. Comes zooming in over the bay, circles around, gets above these guys, checks them out, makes sure they're okay before he leaves. That was great. Next day in class, our son David, I think he was in 3rd grade at the time, he's in class, and his teacher gets telling about what happened on his weekend. And he said, yesterday my daughter and I were out in a rowboat, and the wind came up, and we got stuck out there. We weren't sure we were going to make it. And we were so amazed because all of a sudden this Coast Guard helicopter came over and was circling us to be sure we were okay. And David's going, my dad called me. But one of the reasons that we don't fear the sea so much is because we have things like Coast Guard helicopters, and we have power boats and all that stuff. But in ancient times, when most people couldn't swim, and you relied on wind power to get anywhere, and you were in these little tiny boats, the sea was a scary place. And it had all kinds of things in it that you didn't know what was down there. You didn't have scuba divers or submarines. It was a mysterious, dark, foreboding place to ancient people. In fact, David, in Psalm 74, trying to describe how powerful God is, he says, look at this. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. That was a poetic way for David to say, God, you are powerful, because the thing that seems so uncontrollable, so fearful to me, you can divide it, you can crush it, you can win. Well, we also have a lot of Near Eastern religious imagery that revolves around the sea. For the Babylonians, right? That's where Daniel is living. That's where he has his vision. These are the people that he's talking to day in and day out. They had their religious pantheon of gods, and one of those gods was a goddess named Tiamat, and her name, translated, means the sea. And Tiamat, the sea, warred with their other chief god, Marduk. And Marduk eventually killed Tiamat and used her body to create the universe. However, Tiamat was only mostly dead. She keeps rearing her head throughout their mythology, trying to disrupt the created order, and that forces Marduk to finally set boundaries around her to hold her in place. Now, that doesn't give those myths validity, the fact that Daniel used this kind of imagery, but it does tell you that just like for you guys, when I flash a picture of an eagle, you go, freedom! These people, you come up with the word the sea, the domain of Tiamat, the place of fear and trouble and darkness, and immediately they're going, oh, this isn't good. Anything coming out of the sea, monsters out of the sea, that's bad news. And so Daniel's audience already had this strong association, and so God used that imagery they understood to communicate to them. Not only do we find this coming out of the sea, but the four winds are involved. The four winds are stirring up the great sea. And for people who, if they were going to get around on the sea, needed to sail, wind power was how you're going to get anywhere, to have wind coming from every direction at the same time, you're in big trouble. It says this is universal, it is overwhelming, there is no way out. There you are on the high seas with wind coming from every direction, and now, coming up out of this troubled sea with the wind coming from everywhere, we have beasts. And four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. This kind of reminds me of those old Japanese horror flicks, right? When Godzilla, right, comes up out of the ocean, comes walking toward Tokyo, is going to stomp on all the buildings. So he says now these four great beasts, these monsters, arise out of the sea. So who are these beasts? Well, the first beast was like a lion and had eagle's wings. As I looked, its wings were plucked off, it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. Okay, remember I said you need to understand what the imagery said to the people who lived at the time that God gave them this image. Let me show you an image that comes from Daniel's time that everybody would have been aware of. This is called the Lamassu. It is an ancient Mesopotamian deity, and we find this both in Persia and in Assyria around the time of Daniel. And you'll see what you have there. You've got this lion's body, he's got eagle's wings, he's got horns on his head, he's got claws on his feet. And so Daniel's vision would have said very obviously to the people of his time, oh, he's talking about us. That this is the kingdom that we live in. And there is the eagle wings and the lion body. And then we get a second beast. Another beast, a second one, like a bear, raised up on one side, had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. So it's like it's already killed something. There's bones sticking out of its teeth. And it was told, arise and devour much flesh. So this is another vicious, dangerous beast we're dealing with, this bear that's being told to get up and go kill some more. Now this is where the debate begins, because if you think that Babylon represents the first kingdom, then what kingdom comes after it? Which depends on how you slice it. When we talk about ancient kingdoms, we talk about the Medo-Persia Empire. The Medo-Persia Empire, while it worked as one empire, was actually comprised of 2 different empires, the Medes and the Persians. And so if you split those out, because the Medes were kind of the predominant power first, later Persia became dominant, but they joined together. If you slice it that way, then Medo is kingdom number 2, instead of Medo-Persia being kingdom number 2. And how you answer that, if you feel you must, has implications for beastie number 3. Here's what beastie number 3 is. After this I looked, and behold another like a leopard, with 4 rows of wings of a bird on its back, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Okay, a leopard with wings. Leopards are fast, leopards are powerful. If you give a leopard wings, you've got something that is really fast, and it's got 4 heads. It's like 4 points of power or intelligence that has come on the scene. So who is the leopard? Well, if you think that the second kingdom is Medo-Persia, then the third kingdom, major power came after them, would be Greece. And this could fit, because Alexander the Great conducted a speedy conquest. It's known throughout history, the speed at which Alexander took over his empire. It's like a leopard with wings. And later, his empire was divided by 4 of his generals after Alexander died. So a leopard with 4 heads, that could fit. Of course, if it is theory number 2, and Persia is the third kingdom, Well, that could fit too, because the Persian army was also noted for moving with lightning speed, and there were, you want to guess, 4 kings of Persia. So maybe it's Persia. Well, that in turn affects how you view beastie number 4. After this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying, dreadful, exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Well, who is that? It's interesting, you notice it does not identify a particular animal with this one. The others we've had, the lion, the bear, the leopard. This one, it just says it's a great beast, and it's ferocious. Now, the reason Daniel couldn't identify this is because he hadn't lived until we had Japanese sci-fi movies, or he would have recognized this is Godzilla. Exceedingly strong, iron teeth, and it stamped what was left with his feet. Come on, that is downtown Tokyo being taken out in every Godzilla movie I've ever seen. Anyway, Daniel sees this powerful theory. So which empire is this? Well, if you've concluded that empire number 3 is Greece, then number 4 must be Rome. If you think that it is Persia, then kingdom number 4 must be Greece. So then, what about the horns? Daniel 7:8. I consider the horns that this final beast had, these 10 horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, the 11th horn, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Well, who is the little horn? Well, if Greece is the 4th kingdom, then the little horn could be Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus defiled the temple, the Jewish temple. He forbid any of the Jewish religious practices to be conducted. But once Antiochus was off the scene, the next thing that happens in Daniel's dream is God's kingdom appears, and the kingdom of God didn't appear immediately after Antiochus died. Now, you might say that Rome is the 4th kingdom, and if Rome is the 4th kingdom, a lot of people would say, well, they think that what it's pointing to then, this little horn, would be the Antichrist of Revelation fame. But again, Rome is no more, and we have not seen the Antichrist established. But as with Nebuchadnezzar's dream, remember way back, Daniel 2, we talked about Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and I said that a lot of the stuff about the idol, the different stages of the idol, that wasn't really the main thing. The main thing was about this little rock that is cut out of a mountain without hands that comes and smashes all of those kingdoms and grows into a great mountain that fills the whole earth, and it's a symbol of God's power and God's kingdom. Well, once again, the most important thing here isn't identifying those kingdoms or identifying that little horn. The most important thing isn't the turmoil on the high seas. It is peace in the high court. Verse 9. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. You see, the kingdoms, the beasts that we've seen up to this point in Daniel's dream, they have been in this successive battle for dominance. But not so the Ancient of Days. He sits as judge over all the rest. And every aspect of his image that Daniel sees conveys holiness and purity. There's white and light and judgment. He says his throne is surrounded by fire. It refines, it engulfs. In fact, again, using imagery that the people of Daniel's time would have related to, it talks about the wheels of fire on his throne, right? Well, they were quite accustomed to taking their deities, their idols, in parades, and they would sit them on thrones, and the thrones had wheels so they could roll them through the streets. Daniel takes that image and he says, no, this is the true God, the God above all gods, and the wheels on his throne, they are wheels of fire. A river of fire comes out before him. And his royal court outnumbers all the armies of earth. just in his court alone, it is thousands times 10,000s that stand before this great king. And the judgment is universal. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. Remember our boastful little horn? And as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. Remember it talked about this beast, how nothing could destroy it? It stomped on and crushed and devoured everything, and yet suddenly this beast has met more than its match, and it is the one that is destroyed. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time, and they were placed in a petting zoo. But we're just getting to the good part. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So who is this Son of Man? Well, look at his characteristic. One, it says that he comes on the clouds of heaven. He doesn't arise from the sea. He's not one of the beasts. He is above the tempest and the turmoil of the earth. Throughout the Old Testament, the rider of clouds was always God himself. When God led Israel out of Egypt, it says that he was in a cloud by day. Exodus 19, the sign that God was at Mount Sinai meeting with Moses was clouds covered Mount Sinai. Leviticus 16, the symbol of God's presence in the Holy of Holies was that a cloud came and rested there. Psalm 68:4, the psalmist says, "Extol him who rides on the clouds." And this one, this Son of Man who comes on the clouds, is gifted by the Ancient of Days with dominion and glory and kingdom. And it says that all people, all languages bow before him. And his kingdom, unlike the rising and falling beast kingdoms, is a kingdom that is everlasting, that will never be destroyed. So who is he? Well, the rabbis early on identified the Son of Man as being messianic. That this imagery looked forward to the long-promised and awaited Messiah, the deliverer of Israel. And then came Jesus. And in the New Testament, one of the favorite titles that Jesus applied to himself was the Son of Man. In fact, if you read your New Testament, that term shows up in reference to Jesus over 80 times. One of my favorite uses comes out of Mark chapter 10, verse 45. He says, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." There's the gospel. The Son of Man creates a personal link. Those other kingdoms, those earthly kingdoms, were monsters. They were things. They were things that overwhelmed others, that oppressed people, that put them into slavery. And yet the one who comes from the throne of the Ancient of Days is someone with a face we can relate to. He's a Son of Man. And Jesus says, the Son of Man does not come like those beastly kingdoms to demand subservience, to crush and enslave, but he came to serve. And rather than destroying, he came to ransom, to redeem, to save people who were in slavery. It is a completely different kingdom. And that brings me to the story of Stephen. Stephen was a believer well known in the early church, well respected. He was the deacon that was put in charge of caring for the widows and the poor to be sure that they had meals, that their needs were taken care of in the church. Stephen was a man of great spiritual gifts. It said he was full of the Holy Spirit. But Stephen also attracted the attention of the authorities that were very opposed to Christians and found himself arrested. And when he was given his day in court to defend himself, Stephen used the opportunity to preach a powerful sermon about Jesus. Well, that was not received well by his congregation. When they heard these things, they were enraged, and they ground their teeth at him. Do those sound like beasts to you? Just enraged, grinding their teeth. I think the King James says they gnashed their teeth at him. They're just so angry. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. In that moment, God blesses Stephen with this vision. And he sees Jesus standing at God's right hand, waiting to welcome him. And then he identifies what he's seeing. He said, "Behold, I see the heavens opened, and who do I see? The Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." Stephen uses the imagery of Daniel to say, that's who's waiting for me. I see the court of heaven, and there is the Son of Man. Here I am surrounded by beasts, and yet waiting for me is the one who rules over them all, the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. They cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and rushed together at him. Then they cast him out of the city and stoned him. Do you see how God grants Stephen this image, Daniel's image of the exalted Son, standing, waiting for him, honoring him at the moment of Stephen's greatest need? Not because bad things weren't about to happen to Stephen here on this earth. The beast, it would seem, for the moment had won. But God gave Stephen a vision to understand that they had not won. That the Son of Man was safe and secure in heaven, and that Stephen was as well. Well, that gave Stephen a lot of peace, I think. But the end of Daniel's vision left Daniel troubled. Verse 15. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So Daniel does what we all do when we read or hear or see prophetic things. He wants to know, what does it mean? And I'm pretty sure that right after what does it mean, his next question was, and when is it going to happen? Because we all want a timeline. Well, here comes the angel's answer. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. Okay, great. That's what we're wanting here. We want some details, some names, some dates, maybe a best-selling book. Let's hear it. He said, these four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth. Okay, that's good. All right. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. Okay, that leaves out a lot of stuff that I was looking for. I'd like a little more detail about this. And Daniel wants to know more, especially about this mysterious fourth beast and this weird, mouthy little 11th horn and its war against the saints. He says, I desire to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from the rest, exceedingly terrifying, and about the 10 horns on its head and the other horn that came up. This horn made war with the saints, and it prevailed over them. So the angel replies. He says, well, it will devour the whole earth, trample it down, and break it to pieces. So Daniel, yeah, he's one bad hombre. And then he says he's going to speak words against the Most High and wear out the saints of the Most High. Okay, so he's not going to be my friend. And the saints of the Most High will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. So Daniel, that's going to go on a lot longer than you would like for it to go on. The problem is these time units, time, times, and half a time. I wish he'd been a little bit more specific as to, well, what are you talking about? Is this hours, days, months, years, eons? What? Well, what we do know is there is first a singular unit, and then there are multiple units, but we don't know how many multiples, and then there is half a unit. And the angel seems to feel like that is plenty of information for Daniel. Well, one way to understand this imagery is that the little horn is going to get off to a fast start. There is a time. Boom, there he is, it's happening. And then there are times, a long period. It's going to seem like his reign, his oppression is just going to go on and on and on, and then there's half a time. In other words, it gets cut off mid-course. Just when you think it's going to go on, just like it has before, suddenly it comes to an end. But the angel doesn't seem to get too stuck on the particulars because he comes back to the main thing. Verse 26, the court shall sit in judgment, and his, the little horn, dominion shall be taken away to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Here's the temptation. Whatever kingdom we find ourselves living in, whatever wild beast seems to be in charge, the temptation is that maybe we should try to make friends. Maybe we should compromise and go along to get along. And Daniel's story over and over again is that it is possible, even in an alien, hostile culture, to live with integrity. In fact, not only is it possible, it's our calling. As Pastor Britt pointed out last week, it is the mission that we've been called to be people who, as followers of Jesus, live day by day with integrity, caring about and seeking the things that matter most to God's heart. The question that gets people fired up when they read a section like this, though, is about that whole Great Tribulation thing. Well, when does that start? How long does it last? And most importantly, do I have to go through it? Let me back us up a little bit. Daniel was alarmed by the turmoil that he saw in his dream. There's a lot of scary images. There's kingdoms violently rising and falling. There's monsters. I'm pretty sure Daniel, given his age, he's up around 80 now, he doesn't think he's going to be alive through 4 major empires. So what was the message for Daniel and his fellow Hebrews living in the empire of the lion with eagle's wings? Well, the takeaway for him was, this kingdom will end. And at the end of it, God's kingdom will prevail. Well, what was the message for God's people who had to live under the lightning terror of the winged, 4-headed leopard kingdom? Well, the message is, this kingdom will end. And at the end of it, God's kingdom will prevail. So what was the message to God's people living under the savage oppression of the bear? Well, this kingdom is going to end, and God's kingdom is going to prevail. Well, what about the people who are living under the savage oppression of the 4th Godzilla beast? What's the message for them? Especially those that are being worn out by that boastful little horn, whoever he is. Well, the message is, this kingdom will end. And at the end of it, God's kingdom will prevail. Let me take you back to Stephen, the martyr. Was Stephen living in the Great Tribulation as we understand it? We talk about the end times. Was Stephen living in the Great Tribulation? Oh, I can't imagine a tribulation much greater than being stoned to death. Do you think as the stones are raining down on him that Stephen was trying to figure out the meaning of time, times, and half a time? No, Stephen just knew that his time had come. And so Daniel's vision, did it make any difference to Stephen? Well, absolutely. Because it reminded Stephen that though his time had come, God was the one who was in control of all times. And that although his enemies had surrounded him and the rocks were raining down, and it seemed that the end was right in front of him, it was not the end. God's kingdom was still secure. God was still on his throne. The Son of Man was the Redeemer and the Savior, and he was awaiting Stephen. What is Daniel's message to us in whatever beastly situations we find ourselves in, whether it is a place of political upheaval or personal upheaval or persecution? What is the message? It may seem like a trial that's going to go on for times and half a time, that it just stretches out in front of us. But here's God's promise. Whether the trial is long or short, it's not going to go on forever. The world has not spun out of God's control. Your world has not spun out of his control. God is the one who marks the time. And when the time is up, he and he alone will be victorious. His kingdom will never end. We're going to take communion together this morning. I'm going to ask the men to come and start serving you. And this morning I was reflecting on this whole area of prophecy. And one of the things that I've seen happen to people before when they start looking at prophetic literature is they start worrying about the future. When is this stuff going to happen? How's it going to happen? How bad is it going to be? How do I escape it? Does the church have to go through it, not go through it? And then it struck me that the counsel that Jesus gave to his disciples when it came to the future was what? He said, don't worry about the future. He said, each day has plenty of trouble of its own. He said, as to the future, your Father knows. He has all the hairs of your head numbered. He knows if a sparrow falls to the ground. He's got the future. Don't worry about the future. So I'm pretty sure that in giving us prophetic literature, the idea wasn't to give us information so we could worry about the future. What it's telling us is, don't worry about the future. God has control. His kingdom will never end. He has control of your situation as well, and my situation as well. And remember, the Son of Man? The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And what you're taking right now, a little piece of bread, a little bit of juice, those are symbols that Jesus himself gave to us. He said, I want you to do this to remember me. And what do these things represent? He said, these things represent my body broken for you. What do most world emperors demand of their subjects? That they be willing to have their bodies broken for the empire. You go to war for me to build my kingdom. What does our king do? He comes and says, this is my body broken for you. What's demanded of every soldier and every empire is that he be willing to go and shed his blood so the king can triumph. Our king comes and says, this is my blood shed for you. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. So I want you to take the bread, take the cup in your own time as you're ready. And whatever the situation is that you're facing, take a moment to pray. Remember what these symbols symbolize, that the King who loves you, that you follow, has given himself for you, and his kingdom will never fail. Let's pray.